Comic Book Confidential movie review. So this movie came out in 1988. It was by Canadian documentary maker Ron Mann. It's a documentary film about comic books. I stumbled upon it because it happened to be in my local video store. Now, I'm a big sucker for documentary films, and I'm a huge comic book fan. So when I saw this in the video store, I thought, great, comic books and documentaries, perfect. I mean, in some respects, comic books aren't actually ideal for the medium of film because they're just a bunch of still images on the page, but a good documentary is a good documentary. And there's no lack of interesting stories about the comic book industry. Certainly the number of YouTube channels dedicated to exploring comic book history and all kind of the weird things about comic book history, it is testament to that. Also, I've seen some interesting stuff recently. If anyone's looking for recommendations, there's a BBC documentary on the life of Steve Ditko. I think it's called Searching for Steve Ditko or something like that. Where they spend like the whole hour just getting into kind of like the political evolution and the artistic evolution of Steve Ditko throughout like his career in comic books. It's fascinating stuff. I think maybe what makes it so fascinating is they're able to just kind of zoom in on one creator and tell his story in detail and kind of get an in-depth look at the characters he created. Which is to say that this movie, Comic Book Confidential, which tries to focus on the history of all of comic books, is, it's biting off a little bit much, and because it's trying to do too much, it doesn't really have time to get into those interesting stories the way that one documentary that just focused on one person might. But I guess the golden rule is review the documentary you saw, not the documentary you wished you had seen. So this documentary tries to tell the whole story of comic books. Everybody. So the corporate famous Marvel comics and the independent comics. So Jack Kirby and Stan Lee are together with Art Spiegelman and Robert Crumb. There are glimpses of fascinating tidbits, but on the whole, the film has to cover so much ground that it doesn't have time to get into detail about anything. I feel like I got to the end of it and I had learned almost nothing new. It was just kind of skimming over like the history of comics that I already knew. Now, the film does... I said it was a whole history of comics, but the film actually does know where to draw the line, kind of. So it starts off with the comic book. So it doesn't attempt to go like all the way back to the earliest comic strips and newspapers and how these eventually evolved into comic books. It just kind of starts out with the comic book as like its own entity. Then the film rushes through the age of superheroes and the introduction of all the superheroes. Then it gets briefly interesting with the horror comic books of the 1950s and the resulting Senate subcommittee on comic books and juvenile delinquency. And if you've not heard about this before, it's worth looking up. But there was a string of horror comic books in the 1950s. I guess nowadays we associate comic books with superheroes. But actually kind of what was popular in comic books kind of went through cycles. Superheroes were popular kind of in the 1930s and 40s, and then they went out of style. In the 1950s, and kind of other genres like horror comic books became popular. But these horror comic books were not yet raised concern among concerned adults. So there's a whole Senate subcommittee on the horror comics. Now, this film is made by Ron Mann, who also made the film Grass. I don't know if anyone's seen the documentary Grass. It's about, the public debate over marijuana. And in the documentary film Grass, he just gets a bunch of kind of old newsreels or old kind of public service announcements against marijuana. He uses the same style here when he's getting into the Senate subcommittee on comic books and the whole kind of moral concern in the 1950s about horror comics. So he finds a lot of old public service films against comic books from the 1950s. Then into the 1960s, the film starts to get into the alternative comic books in the underground hippie scene. By all rights, I should be quite sympathetic to this because I'm have leftist politics myself. But I don't know. I just find the mainstream superhero comic books much more interesting, or at least much more familiar. I mean, I know objectively superhero comics have limitations, so probably the alternative ones are objectively more interesting, if that's possible. But the mainstream superhero comics at least have had much more of an impact on culture, or at the very least are much more kind of aligned with mainstream culture. So as kind of somebody who takes an interest in cultural history, I would almost have preferred it if this film had kind of stayed with mainstream comics. But they don't. They go into the alternative scene. So you get Harold Crumb, and then you get Zippy the Pinhead. Now, Zippy the Pinhead, by all rights, should not be in this documentary. Because remember I said that this documentary was not doing comics. It was doing like the comic book, as like the medium of the comic book like you would buy in stores. Zippy only appeared in newspaper comics. So the director is kind of going outside the area that he chose to focus on. I guess he was just really a fan of Zippy, but it gives the impression that this documentary is not so much a thorough history of comics as just a selection of whatever the director felt was cool. In short, it wasn't quite the documentary I was looking for. But if your tastes run different than mine, you might well enjoy it. By the way, this is one of my scripted review series, which is one of my old reviews that I wrote up on the blog years ago. And it's worth mentioning, I did get somebody commenting on this. They told me that this film, at least in Toronto, went on to become a standard late-night fill-in. I guess because the director Mann is from the Toronto. And he commented on Zippy the Pinhead's inclusion, and he said, it might seem a little bit strange in this day and age, but consider how this film was shot before the advent of The Simpsons. In the days before a yellow-colored family ruled the airwaves and public consciousness, Zippy was as close as we got to genuine comic strip satire. Well, him in Life in Hell. If Mann had scored an interview with Matt Groening, his film would be pure gold. What a bunch of characters, huh? Max Gaines, Stan Lee, Ed Alia. Yeah, it's definitely worth a look. So yeah, there you go. Point, counterpoint. I guess I'd probably agree that it's worth a look. It's interesting if nothing else.